Hello and welcome back. This is ProTaleDev back with another recap video, and just like last year and the year before, we're going to recap kind of what we've worked on throughout the year, our development in terms of game design, and kind of go back and have a look at how I feel about some of the projects I worked on. To start off with, it's obvious that I only worked on 2 projects. Well, I only showed off 2 projects. I actually worked on about 3 or 4 projects, and I worked on a game jam that I was taking part in, but ultimately left because the project was just very poor. This is partly due to the fact that some of the ideas just did not mash together, did not work. It happens, especially when you're on your own and you can't get any feedback on that kind of thing. Sometimes you get failures like that, and this year there's a couple of failures in terms of projects. However, there was one very big successful one and another project, a game jam, which came towards the end of this year that I took part in, that I actually showed off, and that was actually a very successful one. Now, when I define a project as unsuccessful, I usually mean that it ultimately didn't pan out in the way that I wanted. In terms of the idea, it doesn't maybe show off the idea that I wanted, or perhaps it was very much broken and doesn't build or things like that, and ultimately I didn't get time to finish it. I liked projects to be more or less in a finished state because then it's very much you can just demonstrate it, and it feels like it did accomplish the initial goal that I set out for it. If it doesn't do that, I'll usually not show it. So in December of last year, we basically took part in a game jam, same as this year, and at the very end I released the final video just in the start of this year, which was the Turtle Trial 20,000 lines of code later, and I'm going to do something similar for Dungeon Architect, since that was a very heavy coded game, probably the heaviest coded game I've ever made so far, and by far it has the most features and most development I've ever done. It's very complex. It's also the most optimized game I've ever made. It's very intense, so I'm very looking forward to exploring that next year. So starting off, let's talk about the very first video, which is the very first iteration of Dungeon Architect. So the initial idea was to expand on some of the ideas I had for Dungeon Farm Tycoon, where I wanted a kind of a building game, a god game, where you could sort of build buildings and manage, sort of have a little game that's like a simulator and a manager, and kind of build on this island, and then focus it around a dungeon economy. And I wanted to expand that idea into a more 3D environment because I just wasn't satisfied with the Dungeon Farm Tycoon. Thought there was so much more that I could do with it and kind of expand it. Of course, I had to stick with the low poly art design because that's all I could create myself at the moment. I can make more advanced designs and more advanced modeling, but it takes more time, and I just don't have the time to develop a game and make models at the same time, so low poly is what I decided on. Now on screen what you're seeing is the very first video that I released for Dungeon Architect, which was from 2D to 3D. Basically I took a month out, I believe, to basically work on converting a lot of the 2D code into a 3D code and converting a lot of assets, essentially getting new assets in and kind of fixing the way that the custom grid was coded to fit a 3D environment. And so I converted all that in to give us a basic game that we could use. That took about a month for me to do. It was quite a long process. There was a lot of things that I had to work on. I was also going to work with the new universal render pipeline, and so I had to get used to using that as well, since I haven't used that a whole lot. The conversion of converting from Dungeon Farm Tycoon to this game ultimately went really well. It still took a month, but it ultimately gave me a very basic foundation for this game going forward, and you can see already that it looks very similar to what we ended up having, in that sense of the UI and kind of the looks of the island and things. Of course, this was just the first iteration. There was a lot to do. Now during the first iteration there was things like disasters added, things that like experimenting with shaders, so for the waves and for the water, and some other shaders for clouds and things that I worked around. We also made low poly monsters as well in Blender, just very basic monsters that would work into our game, and of course we rigged them as well. And then coming towards the end of the Dungeon Architect first iteration, I did a lot of optimizing with the profiler. And this would mark the very end of the first iteration. Of course, there was still a lot more planned for this game in the very beginning. We needed to add dungeons and things to it. So this was just the first part of the game, which was the island building and the management. The next part of the game would be to do with players actually being in dungeons and being able to fight and explore. And so that brings us to our second iteration. So the very first video that I released for the second iteration is actually Dungeon Architect Dungeon Blueprint. So basically I created a system that used blueprints. Now when I say blueprints, I don't mean like an internal addition or anything like that for Unity. It's actually something I created, basically a script that controls the dungeons generation and their prefabs, and we bring we use this blueprint system as a way of a manager. And this dungeon aspect was really tough because I'd never done something like this. I generated things naturally before, but I hadn't implemented that kind of generation alongside the building aspect, and ultimately it didn't work out. Of course, this was the second iteration, and I spent a lot of time on this dungeon blueprint system that I was making, a lot of the generation, and ultimately it just did not work. It is a shame because I did spend a lot of time trying to alter the environment. I used things like polybrush to make shading of the low poly material. I tried to basically bring in prefabs into a grid and allow the player to build the actual dungeon itself. And even to this day, I'm a little bit disappointed that I couldn't get it to work in the way that I wanted. So ultimately, the whole point was that you would be able to build on a grid the same as the buildings that you could do on the islands, and essentially you'd be in this editor. You'd be able to build all of the dungeon yourself, and then you could switch over into the actual dungeon mode, the adventuring mode, and go in as a player. There was a lot of problems with this though, because it ultimately meant that the player kind of knew the dungeon layout, and the only way to solve that would be to have everything in the dungeon internally random generate, that way to keep it interesting, and do it with monsters as well. However, having the whole dungeon as something that you created yourself made it a little bit boring. So I played around with lots of ideas, things like generating the dungeon at random parts while you generate some other parts, or having the whole dungeon generated on its own and then only later on you could edit it. Ultimately though, I could not get it to work in the way that I wanted. It just wasn't fun to play, and so I ended up scrapping that idea, and that was the end of iteration 2. Of course, during iteration 2 I created other things along the way. So apart from that dungeon blueprint and system, I also created the NPC models in Blender. I also created a tower defense system. So basically creating turrets, slow down towers and things like that, and then adding in as part of the disasters, the monster raid was really fun, having them chase down guests. And I also created an XP system and a customized character system, which is standard for a lot of games these days, to be able to customize your own characters. And this was all taking part alongside iteration 2. Of course, as I mentioned, once the blueprint system for the dungeon was scrapped, and a lot of the way that I was managing the dungeon was the idea was scrapped and starting from the beginning, a lot of that time had basically been wasted. A lot of the code though was salvageable, and I could use it to create a new system, but there was a lot of it that I just had to get rid of and start again. And so we come to the next iteration, and that video that I showed was the Dungeon Architect Dungeon generation, and that was the start of the third iteration. I had completely redesigned. I think I spent quite a lot of time behind the scenes. I think the videos were being uploaded once or twice a week around this time, and that's because I basically redid the entire system. I think I was redoing a lot of the UI as well. I added in the Adventurer Guild, general stats, island managers, expansions. I basically redid absolutely everything in terms of the UI. and I redid the dungeon system. I created expeditions that the player can take part in and basically explore automatically generated dungeons. That way the player could have a little bit more fun, and I added in these like difficulty systems. Basically I would, just to break down that system, I would basically generate a code with, or what other players call a seed, and that seed would actually determine what the dungeon appears at, what rotation they'd have, what kind of enemies would spawn, what kind of theme they would have. So that code would then get transferred into the scene with the specific dungeon, and it would just generate it based on that code, and then I would, whatever accomplishments I would have in that dungeon would basically get sent back to the original scene. So it would get saved, pass that information over, update that information, and then send it back, reload it into our new scene with the island so that you can look at your stats. And that allowed us to bring in gold and XP and other things, crystals, from our dungeons straight into a new scene, and bring all that data over that was saved and then loaded in. I don't think I'd ever done that kind of transfer of data and that kind of saving system before, and it was quite complex. Ultimately though, I was really proud of it because it meant that we could save things like what kind of enemies we defeated, what kind of general stats we had, how much damage we'd taken, how much healing we'd done, things potions that we consumed, specific attacks, weapon usage, durability. We managed to track a lot of information, and it was very, very worth it. And of course, in that iteration, the third iteration, the final iteration, we created a bunch of crafting, but much better crafting as well, for the potions and for the weapons. We added a bunch new weapons as well. We expanded the weapon system a lot. We redid animations. We added animations for all kinds of things. We reformed some of the disasters and fixed a lot of their issues. We also tested a bunch of new areas. A lot of these dungeons needed extensive testing, so there was a lot of testing and a lot of optimization. Optimization was really heavy in this project. We added in the main menu, we added pretty much everything, and the biggest thing of all was I added in a bunch of levels. So something I usually don't do, and I haven't done in many other games apart from Turtle Trial, is adding new levels that have new challenges, because it takes a lot of time. And usually in game jams you don't get that chance to add in a bunch of unique levels. I believe I did it in Monster Descent, but apart from that I don't usually do a lot of different types of levels. With this game though, I believe I added in something along the lines of about 10 to 12 levels, something like that. And they all had their own objectives, they all had their own dialogue systems, they all had their own audio. We had music and audio sounds, so sound effects. We had a bunch of unique attack effects. This game had basically everything that I'd ever worked on in the past and in the present, and everything I'd ever tried to do is mixed into this game. So things like shaders, as I mentioned earlier, I played around with lots of different shaders, but I also did the new system, the visual effects. So for some of the attacks and some of the effects around the game, I used a new visual graph, which I've never used before, and I tried to get this game ultimately ready for what's considered the standard version of a game. So things like 60 FPS standard, and things like looks and lighting. I rendered out all the lighting to get it to a standard, and eventually I ended up with a brilliant game that feels very, very complete. It feels like an actual game that players could do, and I was very, very proud with it. Now then, moving on to the next project. I talked about Dungeon Architect a lot just then, and that's because it basically spanned the entire year and it was the main project I worked on. Now, excluding all the failed projects that I worked on, there was also one other project that was pretty successful and I was very happy with it, and videos are still coming out for it, and that is the Christmas Commandeer. So Christmas Commandeer was the game that I did for Christmas. It was initially planned for I was initially planned to do a Yogscast game jam, but there was none this year, so I ended up just taking part in the winter break jam. So I took part in the winter break game jam and I had a lot of fun. The whole idea of it was that you would play as a character trying to save Christmas, to defeat Santa, who doesn't want to deliver any presents. You would ultimately fix a sleigh that you destroyed, find all the parts for it, fix the sleigh, and then you could leave, and that would win the game. In doing so though, Santa would send his minions and he would attack you and try and stop you, and you would have to build up sweets by defeating enemies to open up the level. I thought this was one of my better designed games as well, in terms of I only made it in 7 days. One of those days was very short, I didn't do a whole lot because I didn't have time, and I think it's one of the prettiest games I've made. I used a lot of polybrush to make it look nice and shade a lot of the material. A lot of the enemies I think were really well done, and I was really proud of it. I spent a long time rendering out lighting and playing around with lighting, and ultimately I was very, very proud of how it looked. The rest of the videos will be going out after this video is out as well, so the last few days, so day 3, 4, 5 and 6 and 7, and I'll have on the 7th day a little bit of a review of the game jam itself and where I came and all the games I played, so I'll be talking about that. So now that I've covered the projects that I've shown off throughout the year, now what I'm going to do is talk about what's ahead. I've kind of just looked at everything this year and then thrown it all into this one big project, which was Dungeon Architect, and I don't want to do that for the following year. For the following year I want to do a lot more game jams, a lot more smaller jams, and a lot more smaller games, to try and test my ability to be able to create those games on the fly. But I also had so many other ideas this year that I wanted to do, but the Dungeon Architect just took all of my time. And any of the other projects that I did that ultimately failed were due to the fact that I just hadn't had a whole lot of time to think about them and to work on them, and so I really want to try and make a lot more games this year, but of probably less quality and less features, but ultimately I'll probably have a lot more fun doing it, and I'll be able to test out different ideas in that sense. So that's my whole recap of this year. Ultimately next year will be a lot more fun in terms of little projects, but this year was really fun because I made an actual game, like a solid game that people could play and could play it for hours and build on it and have fun and level up and stuff like that and do all kinds of things with it. Ultimately I'm hoping that I can get this on Xbox, just like I did with Turtle Trial, because I got a really good reception for Turtle Trial. A lot of people have played it, you know, thousands upon thousands of people have tried it now, and so I want to kind of have that same experience with Dungeon Architect if I can get it working on Xbox. Of course it's a lot more trickier than that, but fingers crossed. So hopefully I'll have a video on that at some point next year. But yeah, looking forward to next year, should be fun. So this has been ProTaleDev, and I'll see you next year.